Witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie na ostatnim.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the last panel discussion of this year's conference. All that's good comes to a quick end. I hope this is going to be a fruitful discussion. This is going to be about the future of the European Union. The panelists: Bronisław Wilczstein, writer, publicist, on my right; Bartłomiej Radziejewski, chairman of Nowa Konfederacja; Mr. Piotr Trudnowski, head of Jagiellonian Club; Rafał Ziemkiewicz, writer, publicist; and Antoni Dudek, professor Antoni Dudek, historian, politologist, publicist. Dear professor, let's not before we go into the details, tell us what Poland should do in the current dispute with the EU in the context of EU's future. Let me start with a declaration, because in my opinion, when we start discussing the future of the European Union, we have to mention the past. Poland has been a member for 15 years now. And I see the balance of this membership as a positive one. That is, I see no disadvantages, while I definitely see, it's not that I don't see any disadvantages, but I see advantages as much more significant than the disadvantages. Although
architektura świata przypomina takie stoliki, przy których się zasiada.
I think that Poland should continue being member of this European table, well, because such institutions, such creations as the EU are like a table at which countries sit, and sometimes countries might leave, like in the case of the UK recently. Definitely there are countries for whom being a member of the EU makes no sense. These two are Switzerland and Norway, and that's why they refuse to become members twice in referenda. I don't want to go into the details of the why that is so, but, you know, looking at their history in the last 200 years might give you a glimpse of why that makes sense. But in our case, leaving the table does not make any sense. And this, from my point of view, means that since we are at the table already, we have to look at the rules of the game. And these are varied. It's not like in a typical board game where there's a limited set of rules for everybody. In the EU, there are many levels of this game, and you need to understand that game well to be a good player. In order to understand it well, you need a lot of people, to have a lot of people there at the seat in Brussels. Since we are there, I think Professor Krasnodębski and others already said that you need to build coalitions, alliances of all kinds. I think it's untrue to say that we can have an alliance within the Three Seas initiatives to counterbalance the Germans and French. I don't think so. I think we need coalitions with different countries in different issues. Let's take our relationship with France. There's an area of potential alliance that is energy, nuclear energy. On the other hand, there's an area where we are on separate poles, and we have completely different interests, that is transport policy. So in one issue we're going to be friends, in the other we're going to be enemies. And in order to build such multi-level coalitions and to play this game, we need to have people who understand the rules of the game and who are present in Brussels. And this is where our weak point is, our Achilles heel, after these 15 years of membership. And the newest data I have is from 2019. Among the public servants in the EU, Poles stand at around 5%, while our share of population stands at around 8%, while at the highest decision-making positions, which are 2,753, there are only 38 Poles. That's not much more than 1%. And this is a short answer to why we are losing the game at many levels in these European systems, deals, constellations. So we should start with the the Polish state to support Poles who compete for the positions of European civil servants. I have never heard of schools specialized or public institutions supporting young people in achieving those positions. And this is how to fight for our interests from the inside instead of only through declarations in front of cameras. Now let me address Editor Wildstein. Would you agree with that Achilles heel? Because we, until recently, you had the head of council of the parliament, and things were not so rosy back then either. I don't know if you will agree about that the discretion is not about whether to sit at the table, but how to sit. You know, some might say you might be sitting under the table and wait for what falls for you from the table. Or you could lie on the table. I don't think that's the role we aspire for. Picking up on what my first speaker said, I would agree, but it's not so important. It is important because that's something we have to do, but that's not what our position in the EU depends. We're talking about the EU, and this EU keeps evolving significantly. If we're saying we want this or that forever, or we bring into question this or that, that's absurd, because we joined this constellation because it's an entity that keeps evolving, changing. We entered this game because we came to the conclusion that it made economic sense. We might agree that, okay, it still makes economic sense, although the costs are ever higher, and now there are certain fundamental doubts being raised, but it's certainly no certain thing that it will always make sense for us, because things might change so that it will stop making economic sense. So, you know, declaring things, saying, you know, is once and forever makes no sense. And some situation with this and that condition, framework condition, will stop making sense, and we should stop being a member, leave the EU. And someone might say that's treason. No, that's not treason. That's a treason of the mind, maybe, and those who say that make it, say it with a particular goal. So what are we talking about? What's basic in this case? I agree that our alliances indeed should be formed at various levels. I agree with all of that in this constellation. But at the same time, let me point out that it is natural to gravitate in such a way that our neighbors in Central Eastern Europe have a joint interest, common interest, stemming from the fact that we are treated in a certain way. We are treated as countries of a second category, those that should follow orders. These are the countries of the new Europe, because we joined the EU relatively recently, and as it was illustrated by Jacques Chirac, the French president, former French president, we decided to enter a certain constellation that other countries joined before. At that point, Poles lost the opportunity to shut up. And we have, as a result, a certain common interest with these countries of the Central Eastern Europe. That is, we have to oppose that dominance. And this dominance is, to an ever larger extent, the dominance of Germany. So it's a broad phenomenon. And speaking of what the Union is altogether, we have to start by defining our relationship with the European Union by referring to a broader issue of cultural revolution rolling through not only Europe but the West. The EU has become a vehicle of that revolution. It is adopting the norms of that revolution as its own. These should be the values, the European values, so-called. That revolution is installing a new ideology, which has no name. Sometimes when we are unable to name certain phenomena, we refer to the past and say, what revolution were you talking about? I recently heard a publicist, a politician, say he was a proponent of Hayek, he used to be liberal, conservative liberal. That makes no difference because this is a new ideology. So it's interesting how the left and with liberals were combined, and a new ideology was born. I call it the emancipation ideology, which is supposed to emancipate man from his identity, and this has become a perfect instrument, quite like all this kind of revolutionary ideologies, has become a tool for a certain group to take over the power. It's an establishment, it's no party, it's an establishment, it's the elite at all levels, business, corporate, law, legal elites, creative elites, media elites. These elites want to control the reality. They have called it liberal democracy, that is a democracy that has to follow certain ideological rules, and if somebody is elected who does not accept this new orthodoxy, they are called a populist. So there was Trump, Kaczynski, Law and Justice, Orban, Salvini. They are going to be populists. Whatever they say. And these divisions between left and right that have no reference anymore, there is a blurring of lines between establishment with the protesters against the status quo. Last sentence of introduction, not to drag over. We are dealing with a growing discontent of European nations. And this means that we have an opportunity to play an important role in the European plane, in spite of the fact that we are just a medium-sized country and our potential is not so big. Thank you very much. Now, a question for Mr. Ziemkiewicz. In this revolution mentioned by Mr. Wilstein, you recently wrote a book about that entitled Strollowana Rewolucja. Do you agree? Do you also think that Poland may play a role in this counter-revolution? That we might create an alliance of countries that might present a different vision of the European Union, implement it? Or do you think that's a pipe dream? Sure, we can, but what for? What is our interest in doing that? My proposal is to think about what our interest is in Europe, and which among them push us to being more pro-EU, and which direct us in the other way. So, why we joined the EU was because we wanted to be part of the internal market with its freedom of capital, labor, and services and goods. These are the three freedoms that we wanted to benefit from. I don't want to partake in the discussion about whether the balance of advantages with gains and losses is positive or negative, but we will all agree, I think, that it's thanks to the access to the EU market. I think it used to be one author said in his letter to Czesław Miłosz that Poles needed Russian butts of the gun to beat out of Polish heads their ideas. That's a kind of attitude where the point of view is adopted where the participation of in these political structures is a cost. It's a cost that we have to bear in order to partake in that European market. Now, let's look at how things have developed in the EU. On the side of our benefits, we see the three freedoms, and that's a definite benefit. Since Macron, we've seen Macron, who has won the elections by saying that he does not agree to French factories being transferred to Poland and Polish drivers taking the jobs of French drivers, etc. Where we were winning in the free market, it is claimed that Adam Smith was wrong and interventionism at the EU level is necessary in order to guard one's interests. On the other side, there is the cost in the form of the participation in the political structures of the EU. I think that everybody will agree with my stating that they are expanding. They keep claiming outside of treaty competencies for a couple of reasons. One is the goal of creating an organization of countries that have transferred their some of their responsibilities to these institutions to safeguard these three freedoms in order to build a federal state, which means going away from Robert Schuman concept, which is also present in Wyszyński's and Dmowski's writing. That is the philosophy according to which nations, through representation, negotiate internationally the possible acceptable modus vivendi. We are moving instead to a philosophy saying that nations are bad, they should be destroyed, and we need to create a central power that will manage redistribution within the EU. And that's a crazy plan. That's a plan that does not factor in realities. That's an attempt at making the EU become a new Yugoslavia, a place where everybody is dissatisfied with the central government, with no democratic mandate. It's like in the Soviet Union, where all the member countries said we were all poor because we were sending everything to the Soviet Union, and the Soviets and the central governments hated all the others because they felt they were sending everything outwards. So this is a combination of redistribution with central management, which means that everybody feels that wealth is stolen away from them. But that's one thing. Then the other thing is that this state being created is one with a very strong ideology, not only cultural and identity-wise, but also with a concrete program of justifying a revolution. Europe ranks 8th, I think, in CO2 emissions, and it adopts as a goal to make world zero emission. I don't want to go into the climate swindle because that's an issue for several minutes, and it's a separate theme. I don't want to go into that. We are dealing with a plan that will not impact the climate, but it's an attempt to reconstruct the whole economic system, transferring energy, the energy system somewhere else, winning new concerns, business concerns over old enterprises. This will reorganize the system completely. So if we are talking about creating a central European state, carrying out a plan that will take wealth away from people, then in order to implement that, you either you need a huge army like the Soviet Union, or it'll end in a disaster. Particularly since, on top of all that, we have more detailed ideas or more even further attempts to go into the detail of control by the hypothetical central government. So the question asked in the title of the panel, what should we do? My answer is we should run away, unless these trends are reversed. But I don't think they're going to change. A very good question, inaudible to the interpreters, unfortunately. I'm happy you agree with me. If the building is falling, then you run wherever you can hide, otherwise you will be hit by a falling beam. But if there is an opportunity to reverse these processes, because the right will win in France or in Italy, because that's what some keep saying, and things can be reversed.
The ancients had such a saying that if you want peace, you have to be prepared for a war. If not, if you will be prepared, they will not attack you. If not, there will be war. So it's exactly the same. We should prepare for Pole exit if we don't want it. Because if we have such an option on the table that we can run away, we have some idea of existence independently. Of course, it would be ideal to stay within the European economic zone, but exit the political structures, so acquire the status of Norway. But we have no such potential. But maybe we will have it in the future. I'm talking about the ideal situation. So if we have Plan B on the table, we are a totally different partner for discussion rather than when we have no other option. That's all true that is said, but how to play if we enter the negotiations without the assumptions that no matter what, we will not agree for this or that, or we will not, or we will agree and we will not stop negotiation. If we say that we will never exit from European Union or partner in negotiations, they would have to be a complete idiot if they included our view in any way, if it's not backed with any action that we are ready to take. So in a minute, in the second round of questions, you will tell us where to run away. And now to Mr. Radziejewski. So where should we escape? Or maybe we should carry out some reforms in the European Union. When you take a look at the Polish public debate and the Polish foreign politics, what are the conclusions that should be considered by the Polish government? First and foremost, good afternoon. Let me express my point of view. So first and foremost, I present the position of the Polish patriot. That's the most important. And then as a European, Western European patriot, and as an Euro enthusiast, but suffering one. So I'm a suffering Euro enthusiast because I'm for European integration and further progress of it, but it's painful to me to watch how is it done, and it has been already tackled during these discussions. So we got in a situation which is getting even worse. So where are the most vivid mega trends now? So the first one is that the European Union we joined stopped existing. So it ended for the first time with the abolition of the Nice Treaty, and then after the financial crisis when the regulations entered, and now the third wave of the European Union and the third end of the European Union. This is it comes with this federalization that Polish government clashed against. So different mistakes. Law and Justice Party disputes, it clashes with the European Court of Justice, for example, that instigates itself as a federal constitutional tribunal out of any treaty. And we have different topics here, like, for example, the clash of some universal ideas with the national states and member states. But the situation is difficult when it's a part of a larger reconstruction of the previous political landscape, because the conditions where we entered the NATO structure and European Union, these conditions stop existing. So on one hand, Poland is a target of aggression, of hybrid aggression from the east, which is difficult to define. We can see many Polish citizens are lost in the situation. And secondly, we have the deteriorating situation with the European Union. And what can be done about it? I think that I'm close to Professor Dudek. Absolutely, grassroots activity on our potential and institutions should take place. We might say that Poland needs more strength. The stronger Poland in terms of military, demographic, political, and economic, the more difficult is to harm it in the European Union. The last 30 years were lost in terms of this strength, and efforts should be sped up, and a strong country should be built. But some things may be added to what Antoni Dudek said. As far as I know, if works over directive lasts about 2 years in the European Union, normally Poland for the first year is not involved. And then, as soon as we become aware that there is something, like, for example, the directive or delegated employees and delegated workers, automatically we want to speed up, we want to organize meetings, and we want to take decisions, participate in it, but we go to this pitch as soon as they already won 3-0. So it's very difficult. It's much too late. So what kind of country do we have? What kind of staff do we have? What is our participation in important processes that affect our interests on many fields? A modern state, an efficient state in the 21st century is a great art, and you will not build it with mobilization of electoral emotions. That requires some grassroots activity. But in order to comment on the current situation, coalitions are important for sure. But in the perspective where Poland became a European victim, the bullied guy, because we, more than whoever, we take the burden of the extension of European Court of Justice, expansion of competence. So we stirred some concerns and emotions in the European Parliament that victimizes Poland. And this position is inconvenient for us and uncomfortable for us. And talking about Pole exit is not the most appropriate way to do now. That is an outcome of the lack of ideas. And playing on Euroscepticism, which of course to some extent is quite efficient, but on the other, that can boost this movement, as we could see it in the Great Britain. So I'm talking about that only in the context of the architecture of the European interest. So the Parliament, the Council, the Commission, and capital cities and European Court of Justice, they act totally different with different intensity. They're quite critical on Poland. And main capitals, so France and Germany, we were listening to some kind of bullying practices from their side. And Macron and Merkel were for compromise. So we should play with possibly the strongest country in this community. We know that Merkel has left and Macron will have elections and Ursula von der Leyen is there to stay. Okay, but let's sum up because your four speakers presented a lot of limitations. So in your opinion, how in the current political setting, what should be the steps taken by the government, taking into account all the conditions that we observe, the institutions, the competence of these institutions, and different fields when the field for maneuver is not so vast. Thank you very much for taking the microphone and to express my views. I can tell you how the government behaves now and whether Polish policy and Polish politics implements its politics, having on mind that it has different options. So first and foremost, there is this basic option, follow or fight. I think that these are the most extreme and the most fundamental paths. So to adapt is to become the European mainstream as it used to look like before the Law and Justice Party took the reins in Poland. This is the position which is reserved for smaller and average countries in the European Union, in short. And another option is to fight. Of course, question whether to leave the battlefield and exit the European Union is something different. But I consider it as fighting in a form of conservative and consistent policy that could be a counter-proposal that could be based on alliances, for example, to block some unfavorable tendencies in the European Union, like, for example, this crawling non-treaty federation, which is fostered by the European institutions. So for sure, this is the scenario that where we have to define our destination. We need the strategy, the final target. We need to know what should be the final shape of this of the European Union, and we should define our allies. And these are going to be the allies in terms of potential and interests. So we are not considering whether there is a chance 20 or 30% that Eurosceptics will win in a few years in a given member state. It's not about it. So to be a constructive player that manages and leads the European Union to fundamental reconstruction. This is the natural position for large countries, for large member states. And we have the problems that we have an average plus country, and both options are not fully satisfactory to us. We are too weak to be a large member state, and I agree with Rafał Ziemkiewicz, Bartek Radziejewski, and Professor Dudek. So we need to transform into a strong country in order to be fully assertive and foster this reconstruction. So as we are somewhere in between of these two scenarios, we have some two options which are peripheral options. We can stay within the mainstream. In some concrete areas, we could follow and fulfill follow our interests, to set some priorities and to let go other issues and to concentrate on others. That would require some extent of strategy, but what Professor Krasnodębski said before, he mentioned that the foreign policy in Poland and in Europe has been hijacked by the weakness of the government, of the ruling party. So foreign policy is very difficult to manage today. So it's very difficult to argue with Professor Krasnodębski. I will just quote some examples of that. So the fourth scenario is what is left to us, and we followed that. We are a non-constructive troublemaker. We are a country without any vision and without any proposal and without any idea in what aspects this integration is beneficial for us. So we follow the mainstream of integration because in the most key issues due to side problems, we are in mainstream. So from Lisbon Treaty to indebtment related to next generation and discussions on Fit for 55, we follow the mainstream. And when there is an opportunity to tell that we're ready to veto something, we're ready to play hard. In the situation we found ourselves now, let me point out Mr. Krasnodębski, Professor Krasnodębski view, that now we can hear some voices that we could start talking and presenting our veto on Fit for 55, but in the context of protection of the disciplinary chamber that will be abolished by the Polish government. So if we got to this moment, something went terribly wrong. And finally, when it comes to mainstream of integration, which is related to and which is perceived as the greatest troublemaker and the pest, we have the third largest process, which is very dangerous. Due to the fact that the European politics and that the European politics had been hijacked and by internal politics, we speed up this non-treaty federalism. So this European Court of Justice decisions on issues that could stir some concerns in other capital cities, they do not stir the same concern here, because at the same time we have a far-reaching understanding that Poland doesn't object to this cease of competence, because we also have some problems, internal problems with the rule of law. So we are not able to win any allies in that respect. And this last process seems the most concerning and disturbing, because it's quite the contrary to what was told, to the story that was told for many years by Jarosław Kaczyński about integration, about that we in the European Union will fight for our interests, that we will abstain, we will object, and we will build a position of smaller and average countries, and we will be the counterbalance to the ongoing federation. And so we could see that we do not see any successful movements on the Polish political stage, and we lead to something quite the contrary, to something that the conservative camp deemed to be the best scenario for the future shape of the European Union. So let me stop here, and I will present examples in my another later on. So as Professor Dudek said, you mentioned about this house which is collapsing. So you have to run away, but where exactly? How would you respond to that? So what should be the direction? Where to go away? I'm under the impression that the largest damage caused by the membership in the European Union is that we stop thinking about our state as something of value and of something bringing any profit. So it doesn't mean that if we are not in the European Union, we have to be somewhere. So with Vladimir Putin, for example, that suggests such way of thinking suggests that we abdicated and we stopped appreciating and value our assets. We are not a poor maid. We're not a poor maiden. It's not like we die when they leave us. This money is not beneficial to us, because for many years they were used to protect some pathology. So if people went to the streets, you would have to do something, but EU money was the sugar coating that was used, and we didn't tackle our problems because everything was covered with the money from the European Union. So maybe it would be better not to get this money and to be forced to reconstruct our state. I think that our state is not collapsing yet. If we don't take into account Günther Oettinger and other commissioners told that according to our estimations, one out of each €1, 0.86 to 89 euro cents comes back to Germany. So thinking in the categories that we cannot lose this money, if we lose just 14 cents, Germans will lose 86. So it's their problem. So the concern of the Polish entrepreneurs with the rule of law in Poland, so they are concerned that if we don't get the recovery and resilience money, that will cause 1 million losses in Germany, and we are one of the main subcontractors of them. It is not like we don't have any assets not to negotiate any modus vivendi. Maybe it not be as ideal as staying within the European economic zone, but outside of this political structure and this new Yugoslavia, which will end up with Balkanization in the end. But to take care of our own interests. So where is the essence of this problem? I think that we are thinking where to run away because we think we have no our state. Of course, we have our state. It exists, but it was built. And here, this is my thesis, and it's a bit outside of the topic of this conference, so I will put it as short as possible. We built a country based on the 19th century official manner, based on national state officers, and we should build a state like a corporation, like a company. So we should control our officers and officials. The Marshal Piłsudski started to govern in this way, and then it's Śmigły that they tried to supervise and monitor the work of subordinates. The manager should cascade tasks, and if it's not done well, he replaces the structure with a new one. And they're not concerned with monitoring everyone, because if somebody is observing a minister, everyone feels monitored and they just follow the suit. They do not want to be creative, and they just follow the rule. And that's why our state is paralyzed in a way. We live convinced that we are the last compartment of the train, and the locomotive is Germany, and that we are doing better or worse, but we continue to be there. Of course, we don't know whether it ends bad for Poland, or maybe we see our future as the Warsaw Kingdom. But this is not sure we have something. So we think that the EU means wealth. But with Fit for 55, the membership in the European Union, this is the import of poverty. And this is something false to think that we will get wealth from the EU. We will get poverty from the EU, and no one hides it. So they try to explain that there will be no airplanes, no meat, only for the most affluent one, and it will be in Neo-Gomułka style for everybody else. And now to Mr. Wilstein. Your first speaker told about the necessity of a strong and wealthy country, that we need our military, political force, and we should shape the European Union as an outcome of that. there is a fundamental question how to do it with regard to all limitations that you mentioned during the first part of this discussion, not to be consumed on this table. That because anytime we want to carry out some reforms, we get some warning shots that not to do it. So how to deal with that, and how the Polish government, what kind of strategy should be adopted by the Polish government? It's highly important question. So, should we do a good country or a bad country? Yes, we should do a good country. It should be well thought, and it should be resilient to all threats. Okay, so we know that it was a very difficult question, wasn't it? But I was under the impression when I was listening to you, maybe not all of you, but some takes presented by you, in the last but one panel, there was a discussion about the Second World War, and some panelists criticized on the officers after Piłsudski, and I couldn't see. And for some time, I was not sure whether it was Poland that invaded Germany or maybe Germany that invaded Poland. And I also learned that that Poland was responsible for the partition of Czechoslovakia, and that's not true. So stories that we led some politics that led to some disputes with the European Union that accelerated some processes, this is a misunderstanding in fundamental terms, and it is visible at many levels. The reforms that were undertaken in Poland, of course, we can discuss. The judicial system reform was the fundamental thing for this state to operate. It was required and needed. The response of the European Union, so firstly of our establishment that went to the European Union and asked for assistance, so they questioned our sovereignty significantly, and they did it also before, because following the mainstream, this is a resignation from sovereignty, because we are not the mainstream of the European Union. We do not define it. So if we tell that our politics consist in following the mainstream, so that means that we are getting subordinate to countries with some interest, and these interests are not always convergent with our own. They are rarely convergent with our own, because these are German interests and others. Of course, to some extent, that might be similar, but Germany will not ask Poland to become a full partner. But they will require Poland to take a totally different role. So if the same environments which resigned from their sovereignty before, they asked the European Union for assistance, it ended like this. So I understood that if we acted wisely, the European Court of Justice or European Commission couldn't do nothing. But having a look at what the European Court of Justice wrote, they are not concerned with they are very straightforward. Some lady who became a vice president, she blocked the functioning of a legal institution of Poland by the time the European Court of Justice decides. So she secures the situation, and she says that one court should stop existing, should stop operating. She could stop the Supreme Court or the Polish judicial system, because why not? Or to shut down the coal mine supplying the power plant. So she's not hiding that. She's quite straightforward. I can remember times when Moscow governed here. I will not compare the two situations, but the rules applied by all these officials, Moscow pretended that they don't govern. I'm talking about the European Union that became a vehicle of this revolution. But it's also a kind of utopia. And utopia will not survive. The naked force govern. The communist revolution purpose was to stop the abuse of the labor force. I do not any other country in which labor force was abused to that extent as in communist countries. So the European Union was appointed in order to tame Germany that were too strong for Europe normally, and that became the tool of European Union. The Lisbon Treaty became a tool not because some smart guys came up with that. They followed some logic. It was a fictitious situation that was unsustainable, and the naked force wins in this situation. Germany didn't want to do it, but Euro became a tool of their economic power. So we told, okay, we can play with that. There are some differences between the European Court of Justice and the European Commission and member states. Of course, they exist to some extent, until Angela Merkel or her successor asks Ursula von der Leyen and says, dear, do this or that, and she will follow. We already had this experience when we had economic crisis in 2007 and 2008. That was a stress test for everything. Do you remember how the European Union operated? All European institutions disappeared. Germans met with the French. They invited English and to take decisions, and the European institutions just followed these decisions and implemented them. I'm telling all that not to tell that if we were smarter and if we acted smarter, we would win this or that. Maybe, of course, we made some mistakes. For sure, this government has made some mistakes, but it was not what led to this situation. As Zdzisław Krasnodębski says, we could function better in the European Union, and in different aspects we would win something more, but in case of fundamental things, not. And the fundamental things mean, are we able to build our country as we want it to be? Are we able to manage our economy as we want it? So as it brings profits to us. If we cannot say no to the European pressure, there is no such possibility, and that should be taken into account.
To teraz pytanie do pana redaktora Radziejewskiego, bowiem
A question for Mr. Radziejewski. I know he has had less time than other panelists, so I hope that you can still comment. Let's go back to the question from the title question. So what should Poland do? Since this is the last panel, it's a kind of summary of the 3 days of this conference. And referring to these asymmetries mentioned by Mr. Wilstein, how do we build the success of Polish state? Well, that's a topic for a 3-hour discussion. While we're the only ones, we're the ones standing in the audience's way to dinner. So I would not like to run over too much. Let me just say that I do not agree with Rafał Ziemkiewicz. I'm delivering on my promise we said at the coffee table that we hoped that we would disagree on something. So let me repeat. What you're talking about might create a situation in which the Polish political class might become a hostage like the British political class at its time. So if conditionalities change, definitely we need to react. The thing is, let's not be fatalistic in what you say, quite contrary to what you say in your book, Jakie piękne samobójstwo. There's some fatalist thinking that climate policy will ruin the European economy. If that really materializes, then we have to react. But as of today, that's not the case. As of today, it's a set of proposals and there is no economic ruin. There is room to discuss the details. No, it's not been introduced yet. No commenting on Mr. Wildstein's comments. The direction of the European climate policy has been known for a number of years. When Tusk with Kaczynski were arguing about the seat on the plane, it was about showing themselves at the summit, European summit regarding climate policy. So why have we done nothing for 11 years in that respect? And now when there's a series of ideas and declarations being voiced, I'm listening to Saryusz Wolski, and he says it's an attack at sovereignty. And then I read the Minister of Environment. He is polite and in the European mainstream.
oczach nas i publiczności. Ale przecież to nie w tym rzecz, żebyśmy się zgodzili z banałem, że dobre państwo, ale w tym rzecz...
It's not about us agreeing on a good state and similar trivialities. It's about looking at how this good state has been used in the last years.
Odpowiadając wreszcie finalnie na pytanie na zasadzie takiego trochę skrótu, myślę.
Answering this question, briefly, due to the conditionalities, building own strength, military strength, counteracting the demographic crisis that we have in demography is one of the main indicators of the power of the state and building own strong economy. That's number one. Secondly, playing the game. Let me go back to the European Treaty, Polish European Treaty. Where is our vision of Europe? Shall we continue to looking inactively, passively at what's going on in the EU, not partake in the discussion, and then at the end of the process shout attacks on sovereignty? Let's act at a different level. We can afford that, but the Polish political elite is not adapted to the Polish needs, and this is no fun anymore, because times have changed and we are about to pay the price of that lack of competency and political strength. Professor, do we know what we are fighting for as a state, as a country, as a society? Because the title of this panel is what should we do, what should Poland do in the context of EU's future? Have we defined our goals as a country, what we're fighting for? Win battles where they're possible to win? It's a question for a representative of the Polish government, because it's the government that should know what they're fighting for. I can just tell you what my impressions are from listening to the government's representatives. They represent, like MEP Jaki said in his part, we are in the Union on our conditions and we're fighting for the other party to accept these conditions. That's the way to go. The question is, how long can you continue along those lines? I'm sure that the answer will be the next election. Let me refer to more general issues, because I agree with what Mr. Radziejewski and Trudnowski said. I'm interested rather in whether Mr. Ziemkiewicz is right. He might be right in his saying that the climate policy will bring about a deep economic crisis and seize and will seize the development, economic development of Europe. That might be true, but I am not as pessimistic as he is, and I'm not as optimistic either as he is in his saying that Poland doesn't need the EU. We are a strong country. Let's have shock therapy, and we will either die or survive. Rafał Rzymkiewicz, as a Polish patriot, is optimistic and says we're going to survive. I don't want that kind of shock therapy. I would rather not leave that EU table that has its advantages besides those economic ones. It has also geopolitical significance, and it's important from the point of view of seeing Poland in terms of investment globally. We are not the UK, and many people interested, fascinated with the UK, thanks to James Bond and the royal family and its universities, etc., will send their children to UK to study. And Poland might not be there anymore, and even if it is, people will conclude far away that it's not an EU country, that we're not interested in that country, and that's worth considering as a dimension to the whole issue. Sure, we can introduce the lowest taxes in the world, and all the dictators and thieves worldwide will run to invest in Poland. Sure, you can have that discourse, but you need the kind of trustworthiness as Switzerland has. When you're in the Central European plain, it's not so easy, and you have to pay attention to what you say. So I'd say there are a lot of arguments, geopolitical among others, for staying in the game at this European table. I agree with Mr. Radziejewski that it might indeed change if the climate policy of the EU results to be disastrous for the European economy. Then a time might come, but we're not going to be first. I think others will come round to the fact that it's gone too far, and they will dismantle the EU, and I think that there won't be a big role to play for Poles, like we did not play a big role in building the project. So I think as of today we should fight for our rights in the EU, but do it with more skill than we have so far, because it's not about banging your fist on the table. It's rather about minute, long, time-consuming and effort-consuming negotiations that altogether combine in the form of big success at the end of the process. I don't agree with the vision in which they are trying to destroy us, so we need to wave a white and red standard and defend Poland. Now, Mr. Wilczek and Ziemkiewicz don't like what's coming to Poland from the West, but I'm not so interested, I'm not so scared of that. Let me give you an example. These currents that are dominant in the EU are hostile to the Catholic Church, to the Christian tradition. We have had 40 years in the communist times, 30 years in the Third Republic of Poland. I'm talking about the church, and it was maltreated for 40 years in communism. It has been blossoming in the Third Republic of Poland. So what is its condition now? What was it during the communist times? Mr. Ziemkiewicz is right. Sometimes that kind of icy conditions are helpful. Mr. Trudnowski, on a final note, do you share that stance? I mean, this minute negotiations approach, or do you think that it changes nothing because after all, the decisions are made beyond our participation in the process? well, if we don't make attempts, then that's a certain thing, and, you know, assuming that it's going to be worse and worse, or that everything is going to be rosy and we will have our sovereignty guaranteed, both approaches are erroneous. I think it's one of our key problems. If that's the alternative that we see, then we have no ability to hold this discussion. My great thanks go to MEP Iñaki for organizing this conference and having this conference and this group, because it's something we haven't been doing for the last 6 years. The first point that I noted is what Mr. Radziejewski mentioned, is that where is the treaty announced by Jarosław Kaczyński in 2016-17 as a start of this discussion about pan-European coalition for a reconstruction of European Union. He said that lawyers were writing it and he had already seen the first sentences. It would be great to adopt our own treaty. Chances are very low, though they're very slim. Still, that would be a good thing for the debate. We are talking about Polexit, which is smoke and mirrors, and while the left is going to the streets, on the other hand, we have this fatalistic view of the European Union as one where it makes no sense to make any efforts anymore because there's no alternative, or on the other end of the spectrum, everything is perfect and rosy. I think many of you have seen the latest cover of Wsieci, and the cover says, talks about how Poles and Hungarians are winning at the game with the EU. While there's a text by Jan Rokita in which he says what Mr. Radziejewski said, that is, in the current deal constellation, the French and Germans are of help, and Ursula von der Leyen is being halted in their attempts by, and it's being said that we have to leave some leeway to those Poles. If we boil all that down to a story of our winning in the European Union because the French and Germans have let us, then I think there's a communication-wise issue, because it's a pipe dream of an existent alternative. The very precise question of whether things could be different and whether we can do something. I think that the rank of the Constitutional Court's rulings would be different. And I'm referring here to the recent rulings about the primary character of Polish constitution above the European legislation, which is a continuation of a long trend of constitutional rulings in Europe. The rank would be higher if there weren't grounded doubts about its capacity to make rulings independently. While if it hadn't been for that controversy, the ruling would now be the exact same, but its importance might be bigger among the European political and legal elites if it weren't that the tribunal, the court, is composed of judges who should not be in the court. And that's an easy way to discard that ruling as an important one.
Była mowa o tym, że musimy się na tym koncentrować.
Now, we're talking about this alliance. What are these diagnoses of the crisis in the European Union? As mentioned by Mr. Wildstein, of what was going on in the EU after 2008 and how Greece was treated and how southern states were treated. These diagnoses are quite to the point, quite relevant among radical leftist intellectuals. Varoufakis Gigoro, where are these conservative responses that we have been trying to give by introducing our philosophers to the European landscape? These intellectuals in the European Parliament are not dealing with giving these diagnoses. They focus on saying that it's so difficult to build in the European Union because we know who dominates. I would really like Professor Legutko or Professor Krasnodębski to focus on defining an alternative that would be convincing for Jarosław Kaczyński for how things could be, rather than complaining about the Cultural Revolution that is going to blow us off. Talking of the Cultural Revolution to blow us away, we could selectively point to certain areas that we don't like and mention, for example, this cultural madness served by the EU and the Western world, and this might be one of the strategies that could be important for us. But for God's sakes, if we agree with that, let's have a policy internally that will support the central right consensus in worldview issues, rather than promoting an approach to internal policies that cause the increase of acceptance of homosexual unions and legalization of abortion law. Because this is the brutal data of the balance, the outcome of the rule of law and justice for the conservative consensus in Poland. It has been significantly weakened. One more thing I would like to add on a final note, picking up on what Rafał Rzymkiewicz said. In the European discussion, there is an unprecedented and EU enthusiasm, and this is something we should try and use as a strength during conferences such as this conference. We have a radically pro-EU society which at the same time does not agree to certain issues proposed by this cultural revolution by the EU and the issue of courts. One example of the previous term of the EU, the White Book of the EC, 5 scenarios for the future of Europe, discussion in the Parliament, European Parliament. Who takes the floor on behalf of ECR? Of these absurd scenarios for the development of the European Union, which illustrates the detachment of the European elites from the societies. It was cited by Kazimierz Ujazdowski, not ECR anymore, who was waiting for his transfer to the pro-EU formation in Poland, because there was no politician who was willing to confront what was proposed by the EC in its document. But then it was okay, it's the EP, it's not the most important institution, that's theater, that's symbolic. Okay, but still that's of importance symbolically. You mentioned Wsieci, so I use the opportunity and recommend the new issue. There's an interesting article about the reform of the European Union, and now Mr. Wildstein.
Już w porządku. Ja tylko chciałem powiedzieć, że
I just wanted to say that in the EU it is being said that the current chair of the Constitutional Court has been illegally appointed, but there are no doubts whatsoever about the appointment. So saying that if the appointment was different, then the importance of the ruling would be more be stronger. I have my doubts. And the other thing I wanted to say, referring to what happens around that is not just that, picking up on what you said. I wanted to comment on this. Thank you. This discussion has been very varied. Unfortunately, we have to finish off with this panel. Many thanks. Bronisław Wilstein. Bartłomiej Radziejewski, thank you. Piotr Trudnowski.
Pan redaktor Rafał Ziemkiewicz.
Rafał Ziemkiewicz. Antoni Dudek, thank you.
Ja nazywam się Karol Gacy, miałem przyjemność dla Państwa moderować tę.
Many thanks for being with us. It was a pleasure to moderate this discussion. Thank you once again.
Udało się. Ja korzystając z okazji. Raz, dwa. Proszę Państwa, ja korzystając z okazji chciałem Państwu bardzo serdecznie podziękować za te wszystkie 3 dni niezwykle ciekawych dyskusji. Dla tych z Państwa.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for your participation. If you would like to catch up with the knowledge, with the panels that you might not have had the opportunity to watch, you are kindly invited to use our website on YouTube. You can use YouTube, Facebook, New Media, Nowe Media. The lectures and panels are available, and importantly, ladies and gentlemen, you received a book that was published after last year's conference. And this year we're going to do the same thing. It's going to include post-conference texts authored by participants of most of the panels.
Dziękuję Państwu serdecznie.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You were an important part of this interesting event. Thank you on behalf of all the organizers.
Chcę tylko... Oczywiście nie mógłbym na koniec, proszę Państwa, tego nie powiedzieć, że...
On a final note, I must say that this conference would not have been possible without the over 20 people, technicians who were responsible for the technical parts, who supported our guests, who took care of the correspondence between States, Sydney, Poland. Thank you very much to the whole team.